The world of magic doesn't end with the turning of a page. Love rises and falls anew, forbidden like poison or blazing like a phoenix's flame. The heroes we thought we knew uncover their hearts once more. So step into the enchantment of emotion and welcome to a world where love is written anew. The night was colder than usual for midsummer, the air sharp with the kind of chill that hinted something dark was moving through the world again. In the dim kitchen of number 12, grim old place, a group of witches and wizards sat around a long table, speaking in low, urgent tones. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by flickering candles that struggled against the gloom. At the far end sat Remus Lupin, quiet as ever, his hands folded loosely around a chipped mug of tea gone cold. His eyes, pale and tired, swept over the room but never truly focused on it. There were too many ghosts here, too many memories. Every mission for the Order seemed to add another weight to his shoulders, another reminder of how little remained of the world they once knew. Across from him, a new voice broke through the heaviness. "So, this is the famous headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix," said Nymphadora Tonks with a grin, leaning back in her chair until it creaked. "Bit gloomier than I expected, but it has character." Several people smiled despite themselves. She had a way of doing that, bringing colour into grey places. Her hair tonight was a brilliant bubblegum pink, glowing like a lantern in the candlelight. She looked far too bright for the grim old house, and yet, somehow, she fit. Remus lifted his gaze, studying her quietly. She couldn't have been more than her mid-20s, young and full of energy. The kind of person who still believed the world could be mended with laughter. He'd seen that kind of spirit before, and how easily war snuffed it out. When the meeting ended, people trickled out, murmuring goodnights and disapparating into the night. Tonks lingered, poking curiously at a portrait that had begun to shriek. "Charming decor," she said, stepping back with mock horror. "Does she ever stop screaming?" "Not unless you'd like to be hexed," Remus replied mildly, coming to her aid and pulling the curtains over the portrait of Mrs. Black. The noise died instantly. "You'll get used to it." "Used to a portrait that insults your parentage every time you pass? That's comforting," she said, and then, with a tilt of her head, added, "You're Remus Lupin, right? Sirius mentioned you." "That's right. You don't talk much, do you?" Remus allowed himself a faint smile. "Not usually." "Good. I talk enough for both of us." She grinned, and for a moment he found himself returning the smile, the first genuine one in weeks. That was how it began. Over the next few days, the Order bustled with movement. Tonks was everywhere, tripping over umbrella stands, knocking over teacups, and brightening the air with her easy laughter. She called everyone by name, gave nicknames where they didn't exist, and somehow made the war seem a little less unbearable. Remus, for his part, tried to stay on the edges. He told himself she was just another young Aura doing her duty. But something about her curiosity, the way she asked about people, about him, unsettled his carefully built calm. One evening, after a long mission briefing, they ended up side by side in the narrow corridor outside the kitchen. The gas lamps flickered, and for a moment the silence between them felt oddly comfortable. "So," she said, rocking back on her heels, "I heard you were one of Dumbledore's favorite students. Top marks, good heart, Bit of a mystery. True. Remus raised an eyebrow. That's quite the resume. I'm not sure I'd go that far. She grinned. Modest, too. Figures. Her teasing tones softened when she caught the faint scars on his face in the light. She didn't look away, didn't flinch. And that, more than anything, made him uneasy. Most people did. You've seen things, she said quietly. You're not the kind who hides from pain. I've had my share, he said, voice low. Haven't we all? Maybe, she murmured. But you carry it differently. He didn't answer. The walls of Grimold Place seemed to press in, whispering of old tragedies. It was easier not to feel, safer. But Tonks didn't let things stay easy. She had a way of asking questions no one else dared, of laughing when everyone else had forgotten how. When she joined him for a late patrol a few nights later, she was all chatter and cheer, darting through the dark London streets with her wand in hand and a grin that didn't belong in wartime. You ever think we'll win? She asked suddenly as they paused under a lamppost. Remus looked at her, startled by the seriousness in her voice. We have to believe that, he said. Do you? He hesitated. I try. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Good enough for me. A gust of wind swept through the street, carrying the distant sound of church bells. Tonks's hair had shifted to a soft lavender, her eyes thoughtful. For a moment, she didn't look like the clumsy young aura who'd spilled tea on Moody's cloak earlier that morning. She looked like someone far older, someone who understood the cost of hope. And when she smiled at him, something in his chest tightened. Remus told himself it was nothing, just companionship, shared duty. But as they walked back to Grimold Place, her laughter echoing off the walls, he realized the truth was far more dangerous than that. It wasn't nothing at all. It was the beginning of something he had no right to want. Dawn crept over the rooftops of London, a pale shimmer of gold cutting through the fog. Grimold Place was quiet for once. The rest of the Order had gone to rest after a long night of planning. In the dim hallway, Nymphadora Tonks was struggling to fasten her cloak, while balancing a steaming mug of tea in one hand. Remus watched her from the doorway, faint amusement softening his tired features. You do realize, he said quietly, that attempting to dress while holding hot liquid is not ideal before a mission. Tonks turned, nearly sloshing the tea on herself. And risk losing my caffeine? I'd rather face a dragon unarmed. He shook his head, a ghost of a smile playing at his lips. You might, at that? She caught the expression, rare, fleeting, and grinned. There it is again. A smile. I knew it existed somewhere beneath all that werewolf melancholy. Werewolf melancholy? He echoed, raising an eyebrow. It's your look, all tragic and mysterious. Probably makes the Death Eaters too intimidated to hex you. Her teasing was light, but her eyes were warm, steady. He turned away before she could see how much the words unsettled him. She treated his curse like a simple fact, not a source of fear or disgust. He wasn't sure whether that made her naive or brave. They were heading north, a reconnaissance mission near the Scottish border. Rumour said a band of werewolves was gathering, and the Order wanted to know where their loyalties lay. Dumbledore had assigned Tonks and Remus together, a decision Remus silently questioned but didn't dare to challenge. By mid-morning, they had apparated to a desolate moor shrouded in mist. The air smelled of rain and wild heather, and the wind carried a distant, mournful howl. "Lovely," Tonks muttered, pulling her cloak tighter. "Just the sort of place I dreamed of spending my weekend." "Stay alert," Remus said softly. "They're not the friendly kind." He led her up a slope, his eyes scanning the ridge ahead. He could sense them, the faint, feral pull in the air, the stirring of something not quite human. His own instincts whispered of danger. They found the camp by sundown. A few ragged tents, a dying fire, the scent of blood and earth. From the shadows emerged two figures, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other with a twisted grin that set Tonks's nerves on edge. "Well, well," the grinning one drawled. "If it isn't Lupin. Haven't seen you since Greyback's pack scattered." Remus didn't flinch. "We're not here for a fight, Kane. We're here to talk." Kane laughed, a low, unpleasant sound. "Talk? You think any of us still care for Dumbledore's charity? You walked away from your kind, Lupin. Why come back now?" Remus's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Because Voldemort is offering you blood, not freedom. You'll see that soon enough." Tonks could feel the tension rising like a storm. Her hand went to her wand. Kane's gaze flicked to her. "An aura? You brought Ministry vermin here?" Before Remus could speak, the man lunged. Spells flashed in the darkness, red, green, gold, lighting the mist like fireworks. Tonks ducked behind a boulder, sending a stunner that caught one werewolf squarely in the chest. Another charge came from her left. Remus tackled her aside, his shoulder colliding with the ground hard. "Stay down!" he barked. But she wasn't the sort to stay down. She scrambled to her knees, hair flashing scarlet as she sent another spell bursting through the fog. The fighting lasted minutes that felt like hours, until at last the attackers fled into the night, howling in fury. Breathing hard, Tonks glanced around the ruined camp. "Well," she said, trying for cheer, "that went swimmingly." Remus didn't answer immediately. He was kneeling, pressing a hand to his arm where blood seeped through torn fabric. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he said too quickly. She ignored him, pulling out her wand. "Episci." The wound hissed, sealing partially, though he winced at the sting. "Next time," she said, "you let me take a few hits too. You're not invincible, you know." His eyes met hers, shadowed and distant. "You shouldn't have been here at all." "Oh, don't start that again," she snapped. "I'm an aura. I can handle—" "You don't understand." His voice rose, rough and raw. "If one of them had bitten you—" "But they didn't," she interrupted softly. "And I'm still here." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind whistled across the moor, tugging at her hair. Remus's anger faded into weariness, and he looked away. "You don't know what it's like to live as I do, to fear what you might become every time the moon rises." Tonks stepped closer. "Maybe not, but I do know what it's like to see someone brave and good punish himself for things beyond his control." Her words sank into him like sunlight breaking through clouds. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that monsters like him didn't deserve compassion, but he couldn't find the strength. They made camp that night in the ruins of an old shepherd's hut. The fire crackled softly between them. Tonks dozed with her head against the wall, wand still in hand. Remus watched her for a long time, the firelight dancing across her face. She looked impossibly young in sleep, peaceful, unguarded, her hair now a gentle brown instead of its usual bright hues. Something inside him stirred, a warmth he had not felt in years. He tried to smother it, but it only burned brighter. Outside, the moon was veiled by clouds, but he felt its pull all the same. The reminder of what he was, of what he could do if he lost control. He turned his face from the fire and whispered to the dark, "She deserves better than this." The wind carried no answer, only the soft sound of Tonk's breathing. When dawn broke, the mist had lifted. She woke with a start and found him already awake, packing their supplies. "Morning," she said, rubbing her eyes. "You didn't sleep?" "I don't sleep much on nights like this." "Full moon?" He nodded once. She didn't press further. Instead, she walked to the doorway, the rising sun gilding her hair. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "most people would have run when they saw what we faced yesterday. You stayed. You fought for people who hate what you are. That's not a monster, Remus." He didn't reply, but her words stayed with him as they made their way home. Words that warmed him and frightened him all at once. Because the truth was dangerous. The truth was simple. He was falling in love with her, and that was something he could not allow. Autumn had crept quietly into London, painting the city in muted golds and greys. The air carried the scent of rain and smoke, the kind that lingered in old streets and on worn cloaks. Grimold Place had grown colder too, not just from the drafts that whistled through its halls, but from the tension that always seemed to follow bad news. The Order had suffered another loss, a raid gone wrong in Bristol. Tonks sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring her tea. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. Across the room, Remus was poring over a map, tracing lines with his wand. He looked thinner than usual, pale in the lamplight, his eyes shadowed from too many sleepless nights. She wanted to speak, to break the silence that pressed between them. But something about the way he stood kept her quiet. There was a distance in him now, more than before. Since their mission in the Highlands, he'd grown careful around her, polite, professional, but never quite present. When she finally rose and crossed the room, he didn't look up. "Still brooding over those maps?" she asked lightly. He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Just planning the next rotation. Dumbledore wants the werewolf situation monitored more closely." "Which means you'll be out again?" He hesitated. "Likely." Tonks sighed. "You know, for someone who claims to value teamwork, you're rather talented at disappearing." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Some things are safer handled alone." "Safer for who?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer, and that silence told her more than words could. Tonks straightened, her tone sharper now. "You can't keep doing this, Remus. You can't keep shutting people out as if that protects them." His gaze finally met hers, steady, unreadable. "You don't understand." "Then make me," she said, "because I'm getting rather tired of guessing." For a long moment, he said nothing. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound between them. Then he sighed and turned away, bracing his hands on the table. "Every month," he said quietly, "I lose myself. For hours, I become something that hunts, something that kills if given the chance. And when I come back, I carry the memory of it, the scent of blood, the noise, the helplessness. It doesn't fade, Tonks. It never does." His voice was calm, but beneath it was something raw and breaking. "That's why I can't." He stopped himself. "Can't what?" she asked softly. He exhaled as though the word itself pained him. "Can't be what you think I could be." The air between them trembled with unspoken things. Tonks felt her heart twist, but she refused to look away. You think love's a luxury only for people without scars? Because if that's the case, half this house is disqualified. Tonks. No, she said, her voice steady. You think you're sparing me by keeping your distance, but all you're doing is proving that fear runs your life, and that's not the man I saw on that moor. He stared at her, speechless. She waited for him to argue, to retreat, but instead he only turned back to the map, his knuckles white against the parchment. When she left the room, he didn't stop her. The weeks that followed blurred into routine. Tonks threw herself into her duties at the ministry, intercepting cursed objects, tracking Death Eaters, and helping with Muggle evacuations. But her usual brightness dimmed. Her jokes came less easily, her laughter softer. At Grimold Place, even Sirius noticed. She's got it bad, he muttered one evening to Remus, who was repairing an old Order communication mirror. Remus didn't look up. She's tired. Everyone is. Sirius snorted. Don't play dense with me. I may be locked up in this blasted house, but I'm not blind. You and Tonks. There's something there. Remus said nothing, tightening a screw that didn't need tightening. Merlin's beard Mooney. You think you're protecting her, don't you? Sirius leaned forward, eyes glinting. That same old noble nonsense. You did it back at school too. Never let yourself have what you wanted because you thought you didn't deserve it. This isn't the same, Remus said quietly. Sirius's grin vanished. No, it's worse, because you actually care this time. Remus looked up sharply, but Sirius only shook his head. You're a fool if you think pushing her away will make her forget you. Some people are stubborn like that. You should know. When Sirius left, the silence in the room seemed to stretch endlessly. Remus sat back, staring into the flickering fire, and wondered if his friend was right. A month later, Dumbledore called an emergency meeting. Intelligence from Snape suggested the Death Eaters were targeting a safe house near Cardiff, a place where Order members often took refuge between missions. The Order needed pairs for reconnaissance again. Before Remus could object, Dumbledore assigned Tonks as his partner. When they met outside the old train station where they would apparate, Tonks's expression was unreadable. Her hair was its natural brown that night, her usual bright colours gone. "Ready?" she asked shortly. He nodded. The word felt heavier than it should. They apparated to the outskirts of Cardiff, a quiet coastal village shrouded in mist. The sea roared in the distance, waves breaking against jagged rocks. The safe house stood at the edge of the cliff, its windows dark. Inside, everything was still. Dust lay thick on the furniture, but there were signs of a struggle. Overturned chairs, scorch marks on the walls. They were here, Tonks murmured, crouching beside a burned piece of parchment. Maybe a day ago. Remus was about to reply when a low creak echoed through the hallway. Both drew their wands, moving silently toward the sound. They found a man slumped in the corner, his robes torn, a faint mark of the dark mark burned into his arm. He was barely breathing. Tonks knelt beside him. "He's alive." "Careful," Remus warned. "It could be a trap." But before they could act, the man's eyes flickered open. You have to go. They're coming back." "Who?" Tonks demanded. "Death Eaters. They found out about the message. It's not safe here." Remus looked toward the doorway, and that's when the explosion hit. The blast threw them both backward, dust and splinters raining down. Tonks coughed, disoriented as Remus pulled her behind a fallen beam. Outside, shadows moved, cloaked figures advancing through the mist. "Run," Remus said hoarsely, but Tonks grabbed his arm. "Not without you." The next moments blurred, flashes of green light, shouts, the crash of collapsing walls. They fought side by side, spells weaving through the smoke. Tonks's curse sent one Death Eater sprawling. Remus's shield charm deflected another attack just in time. When it was over, the safe house was half in ruins, the Death Eaters retreating into the dark. Remus stood panting, his sleeve torn, blood streaking his temple. Tonks, trembling but unhurt, stared at him. "You see?" she said breathlessly. "You save me, I save you. That's how this works." He met her gaze, fierce, defiant, alive, and something inside him gave way. Before he could stop himself, he stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Tonks." But whatever he meant to say was lost. The sea roared below, the night wind carrying away his words. And though neither of them spoke, they both knew something had changed, something that could no longer be undone. The morning after the battle dawned grey and raw, the sea wind scraping against the ruins of the safe house. Smoke still rose from the shattered roof, curling into the mist like ghostly ribbons. Tonks and Remus had taken refuge in what remained of the cellar, a small, cold chamber half buried under rubble. Tonks sat wrapped in her cloak, wandlight casting a pale glow across her face. She looked exhausted, streaks of soot marking her cheek, a cut along her jawline slowly healing. Remus sat opposite her, his arm bound with a strip of fabric she had torn from her own sleeve. He hadn't said much since dawn. "You should rest," she said quietly. "I can't," he replied. "You never can," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Even when the world's crumbling around you." He looked up at her, weary eyes softening. "You shouldn't have stayed when I told you to run." "Shouldn't have," she repeated, incredulous. "Remus, there were 6 Death Eaters out there. You'd be dead if I'd left." "I would have managed." "No, you wouldn't have," she said firmly. "Stop pretending you're indestructible. It doesn't suit you." Her voice was sharp, but beneath it lay something trembling. Fear, or perhaps anger born of it. She leaned forward, eyes flashing in the dim light. "You think you're protecting me by pushing me away, but you're not. You're just trying to make yourself miserable before anyone else gets the chance." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do," she said, "because I've done it too. My father used to say I'd never find someone who could keep up with me, that I'd burn out or break, and I started believing him. But you—" She stopped herself, swallowing hard. "You make me want to believe in something again." Her words hung in the air between them, fragile and heavy. Remus looked away, his voice rough. "Tonks, you don't know what it is you're feeling. It's been a long night. You're exhausted. You—" "Don't tell me what I feel," she cut in, her tone trembling. "You don't get to do that." He opened his mouth, then closed it again, defeated by the fire in her eyes. The truth was, he had no defense left. The walls he had built for years, of guilt, of duty, of quiet despair, were starting to crumble, and she saw through every crack. Silence stretched between them. The wind outside whistled through broken beams, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and salt. Finally, Tonks spoke again, softer this time. "When I saw that spell hit you last night, I thought—" She broke off, shaking her head. I thought you were gone, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the order, not the war, not anything. Her confession fell like a whisper, but it echoed loud in his chest. Remus rose slowly, pacing the narrow space. He wanted to tell her she was young, that she would find someone better, someone safer. He wanted to tell her he cared for her too much to let her ruin her life for him. But when he turned and saw her there, brave, stubborn, fiercely alive, the words refused to come. "Tonks," he said quietly, "you deserve someone who isn't this." "You think I don't know what you are?" she shot back. "You think that scares me?" "It should," he said. She stood too, facing him now. "Well, it doesn't." For a moment they stood in silence, two figures framed by the pale morning light filtering through the cracks in the ceiling. Then Remus stepped closer, too close. He could feel the warmth of her, hear the steady rhythm of her breath. "Don't," he whispered, more to himself than to her. She didn't move away. "Then stop looking at me like that." Something inside him snapped, the fragile restraint he'd clung to for months. He reached out, brushing his thumb gently against the cut on her jaw, his touch feather-light. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull back. For one suspended heartbeat, everything was still. The war, the fear, the world outside. Then, just as suddenly, he stepped away. The air between them cooled. "We should leave," he said hoarsely. "It's not safe to stay." Tonks turned her face from him, hiding the hurt that flashed there. She nodded once. "Fine." They gathered what little they had and climbed from the cellar into the ruined daylight. The cliffs loomed above them, the sea below a restless grey. When they disapparated, the ruins vanished behind them with a faint crack, leaving only the wind to whisper over the stones. Back at Grimold Place, the atmosphere was heavy with worry. Molly fussed over Tonks's injuries. Kingsley offered Remus a curt nod of respect. But beneath the ordinary bustle, everyone sensed the weariness that clung to them both. That night, Tonks retreated early to her small room on the 3rd floor. She sat by the window, staring out into the dark streets of London. Her reflection stared back, hair dull, eyes shadowed. For the first time in years, she let her hair fade to its natural brown and didn't bother changing it. Downstairs, Remus sat by the dying fire, alone. He could hear laughter in another room, Sirius telling some story to the twins. But it sounded far away, as if coming from another lifetime. He thought of her words on the moor, of her defiance in the cellar, of the way her voice had trembled when she said his name. He'd been foolish to let it go this far, foolish to think he could keep it from breaking them both. Yet when he closed his eyes, all he saw was the moment she had stood before him in the ruins, her gaze steady, fearless, unafraid of the monster he believed himself to be. He rose at last and climbed the stairs, his footsteps soft against the old wood. He paused outside her door, hand half raised, then lowered it again. "Good night, Tonks," he whispered to the empty hallway and turned away. Inside the room she stirred as if she'd heard him, though the walls between them remained thick as stone. Days passed. The Order's work grew more dangerous, and rumours spread of Voldemort's growing power. The world outside was changing, growing darker by the day. But for Tonks, the real battle was the one she couldn't escape, the quiet war between her heart and his silence. She still saw him in meetings, still exchanged polite words, but the warmth was gone. He was distant again, colder, as if determined to erase every trace of what had almost been. It would have been easier if she could hate him. But she couldn't. Because every time she looked at him, she saw not the restraint or the fear, but the man who had shielded her on that moor, who had smiled despite the darkness, who had held her gaze when the world was falling apart. And she knew then, with a certainty that frightened her, that she wouldn't give up on him. Not yet. Not until he believed that he was worth loving. Winter settled over London like a shroud. The snow fell in slow, silent veils, softening the sharp corners of the city, but doing nothing to warm it. Inside Grimmauld Place, the fire burned low, and the once busy headquarters of the Order felt emptier than ever. Too many missions had gone wrong. Too many names had been added to the lists whispered in the dark. Tonks had grown quieter since Cardiff. Her clumsy cheer still surfaced now and again, but it was dimmed, fragile, like the faint glow of the candle that refused to die out no matter how fierce the wind blew. Remus saw it, though he tried not to. He told himself it was better this way. Better that she forgot the look they'd shared in the ruins. Better that she kept her distance. And yet, every time she passed him in the corridor, every time her voice echoed through the kitchen, that calm resolve wavered. The Order was shifting again. Dumbledore's assignments were becoming riskier, and the walls of Grimmauld Place echoed with tense whispers. The air itself seemed filled with fear and secrets. It was during one of those long, tense evenings that Tonks was sent out on patrol. Alone. "Are you sure?" Remus asked as they gathered in the hall checking their gear. "You've barely slept." She lifted an eyebrow. "Neither have you, and yet you're going out tomorrow, aren't you?" "That's different." "Because you're a werewolf?" Her tone was sharp. "Don't start that again." His mouth tightened. "Because I'm older, Tonks. I've seen what happens when we underestimate the enemy. And I've seen what happens when we hide behind excuses," she said evenly. "I'll be fine, Remus. I've handled worse." He wanted to argue, to insist on going with her, but she was gone before he could. The sound of her footsteps faded into the night, leaving the hall cold and still. Hours passed. The house grew quieter. Outside, snow fell thicker, muffling the world in white. Remus sat by the fire, unable to rest. Every crack of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like a warning. When the clock struck midnight, a knock echoed through the front door, sharp, urgent. He was on his feet before anyone else, wand drawn. The door creaked open to reveal Kingsley, snow-covered and grim-faced, supporting Tonks by the arm. "She's fine," Kingsley said quickly, though his tone betrayed concern. "Just a rough night." Tonks's cloak was torn, her lip bleeding, her face pale beneath smudges of soot. Remus rushed forward, taking her weight without thinking. "What happened?" "Ambush near the river," she muttered. "They knew the route. Someone's been talking." Her words slurred slightly, exhaustion pulling her down. He helped her to a chair by the fire, crouching beside her as she tried to smile. "See?" she whispered faintly. "Told you, I'd be fine." But her eyes fluttered shut before he could answer. The next morning, she woke to find sunlight creeping through the curtains and the faint scent of tea in the air. Her head throbbed, but the room was warm, and she wasn't alone. Remus sat beside her, reading a battered book. His hair was tousled, his eyes shadowed, but when she stirred, he set the book aside. "You're awake," She tried to sit up, grimacing. "How bad is it?" "You'll live," he said softly, helping her ease back against the pillows. "Kingsley said they caught 2 Death Eaters. They won't be troubling anyone for a while." She nodded, then looked at him with a tired smile. "You stayed." He hesitated. "Someone had to make sure you didn't try to sneak back out again." "Liar." The word was teasing, but her eyes were earnest. "You stayed because you care." He said nothing. She reached out, fingers brushing his wrist. "Remus, you don't have to hide it." "I'm not hiding anything," he said too quickly. "Yes, you are. You think if you pretend you don't feel it, it'll disappear. But it won't." He stood, pacing to the far side of the room. "Tonks, please, don't do this." "Why not?" "Because this war is no place for love," she finished, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe that's exactly why it's the place for it, because everything else is falling apart." He turned sharply. "You don't understand what you're asking." "I'm not asking for promises," she said. "I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I don't want to keep pretending this isn't real." He stared at her, torn between the longing that had haunted him for months and the fear that never left him. "You don't know what you're doing." "Yes, I do," she said. "I'm choosing you." The room was utterly still. The fire crackled softly, and the light shifted across his face, showing every line, every scar, every shadow of his doubt. Remus stepped closer, slowly, as though drawn by something stronger than reason. "And if I hurt you?" he asked quietly. "If one day I lose control?" She looked up at him, eyes shining. "Then I'll fight to bring you back." Something inside him broke. The dam of self-denial, of years spent believing he had no right to warmth or love. He sank to his knees beside her, and for the first time in years, he let himself feel everything he'd fought to suppress. "Tonks," he breathed, her name a confession, a prayer. She smiled faintly. "Took you long enough." He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch trembling. "You deserve so much more than this." "Maybe," she whispered, "but I don't want more. I want you." For a moment, the world seemed to still. No war, no fear, only the quiet heartbeat of something fragile but real. Then he leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. They stayed like that, unmoving, 2 souls suspended in the calm before the next storm. When she recovered, the war resumed its steady march toward darkness. Dumbledore's plans grew more secretive, the Order's missions more dangerous. Yet through it all, something between them had changed. It was not spoken of, not declared, but it existed in every glance, every shared silence. There were nights when Tonks would find him sitting by the window, moonlight silvering his face. She would sit beside him, neither speaking, and though he never said the words aloud, she could feel them in the air, the unspoken promise that he would try, that he would not run again. But war has little patience for love, and though they clung to those quiet moments, both knew that shadows were lengthening, that soon even the warmth they'd found would be tested. For now, though, it was enough. Enough to know that in a world breaking apart, they had found something to hold on to. And somewhere deep in his heart, Remus Lupin, the man who had spent a lifetime believing himself unworthy, began, at last, to believe that love might still find him in the dark. The first whispers of spring crept into London, faint and uncertain. The war had grown heavier with each passing week, and yet for a brief time The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting, perhaps, for some miracle. Tonks walked through the deserted corridor of Grimold Place, her footsteps soft on the old wood. The house was quieter now. The laughter that had once filled its rooms had faded, replaced by tension and exhaustion. Even Sirius's reckless humor had dimmed. Too many names had been lost, too many faces gone missing. Remus was away again. He had left without saying goodbye, though she knew where he'd gone. To the fringes of wizarding society, where Dumbledore had sent him to gain the trust of the werewolves still loyal to Greyback. It was dangerous work, and he had gone without hesitation. He hadn't written. Tonks had told herself she didn't care, that she understood. But every night she found herself at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of cold tea, wondering if he was alive. When he finally returned, it was in the dead of night. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of damp air and the scent of rain. Tonks was dozing in a chair by the fire. She woke instantly, heart leaping. "Remus!" He looked thinner, paler than before. His coat was torn, his face drawn and weary, but his eyes, those tired, gentle eyes, were the same. "You're awake," he said softly. "You didn't send word," she said, rising to her feet. "I couldn't. It was complicated." "That's an excuse," she said, her voice trembling with anger and relief. "You vanish for weeks, and I'm supposed to pretend it doesn't matter." His expression faltered. "Tonks." "No," she cut in, stepping closer. "You don't get to disappear whenever you feel guilty. You don't get to decide what hurts me and what doesn't." He flinched, and for a moment she regretted the words. But then she saw it, the faint look in his eyes that said he understood and that she was right. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I thought distance would make things easier." "It didn't," she said. He nodded once, as though he'd known that all along. Then he reached into his coat and handed her a folded parchment. "Dumbledore's message," he said. "We're to meet him at Hogwarts tomorrow night." "Why?" He hesitated. He didn't say, only that it's urgent. The next evening they apparated to the edge of the Forbidden Forest. The night was cold and still, the stars distant pinpricks of silver. Hagrid met them at the gates, his lanterns swinging in the darkness. "Dumbledore's waiting for you," he rumbled. "Said it was important." Inside the castle, the corridors were silent. Students slept behind enchanted walls, unaware of the dangers beyond. The air smelled faintly of parchment and wax, the same as it had when Remus had walked these halls as a boy. For a moment, he almost smiled. Dumbledore was waiting in his office, Fawkes perched behind him like a streak of living flame. His face was calm, but there was an uncharacteristic heaviness in his eyes. "Remus, Nymphadora," he greeted, rising. "Thank you for coming." Tonks winced at her full name, but said nothing. "I have a task for you both," Dumbledore said gravely. "The werewolf packs are growing restless. Greyback has been stirring them with promises of power. I need someone they will listen to, someone who can speak to them as one of their own." Remus nodded. "You want me to go back?" "I do," Dumbledore said, "but this time not alone. Nymphadora will accompany you." Tonks blinked. "Me?" "You are quick-witted, brave and loyal," Dumbledore said with a faint smile. "And Remus will need someone he trusts." Remus frowned. "Headmaster, with respect, it's too dangerous." Dumbledore's gaze softened. "Everything we do now is dangerous, my boy, but I believe this is necessary." Tonks glanced at Remus, whose jaw was set in quiet protest. "I can handle it," she said firmly. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled just faintly. "I have no doubt you can." They set out the next morning. Their path took them north again, beyond the reach of Muggle villages, where the land grew wild and untamed. Forests stretched for miles, broken only by jagged hills and frozen streams. Tonks walked beside him in silence, the wind tugging at her cloak. "You're awfully quiet," she said at last. "I'm thinking." "Dangerous habit," she said lightly. He glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his tired eyes. "I missed your sarcasm." She smiled faintly. "I missed your lectures." They found Zipak at dusk, a ragged settlement deep in the woods where the air smelled of smoke and damp earth. Greyback wasn't there, but his followers were. The meeting was tense. The werewolves eyed Remus with suspicion, their faces hard, their movements wary. One man, broad-shouldered with a scar running down his neck, stepped forward. "Why should we listen to you, Lupin?" he growled. "You turned your back on us years ago." Remus met his gaze steadily. "Because I know what Greyback's promising you, and I know how it ends." The man sneered. "You think you're better than us?" "No," Remus said softly. "I think you deserve better than him." There was a murmur among the crowd. Tonks watched, heart pounding as he spoke. Not with authority, but with quiet conviction. He didn't demand loyalty. He asked for it. He reminded them of the choice they still had, to be men, not monsters. When they left the camp hours later, the forest was silent again. The moon was rising, casting silver light through the branches. "You were brilliant," Tonks said quietly. "I don't know if it mattered," he replied. "Some of them listened. Most didn't." "You tried," she said. "That's more than anyone else has done." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the weight of everything they'd been through hung between them. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. "This isn't your fight." "It's ours," she said simply. He started to reply, but the moonlight caught her hair, pink again, stubbornly bright, and he stopped. For a long time they stood in silence, the night stretching around them. Then, without a word, he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, warm against the cold. They walked back toward the campfire without speaking, but something had shifted between them again. Something steady, quiet, and true. Later that night, as she drifted toward sleep, Tonks heard him murmuring softly to the dark. "I'm not afraid for me anymore," he said, his voice barely audible. "Only for her." And though she didn't move, didn't open her eyes, she smiled, because for the first time he had stopped saying he couldn't love her. He was already doing it. The following weeks blurred into a restless march of missions and silence. The order was stretched thin. Rumors of attacks reached them daily. Death Eaters struck at small villages now, testing the ministry's defenses, spreading fear like wildfire. Yet amid the chaos, a fragile rhythm had formed between Tonks and Remus, a quiet understanding, unspoken but steadfast. They worked together often now, side by side in the field. Sometimes they barely spoke for hours. Other times, laughter would break through the dark like sunlight through clouds. But even when the laughter faded, something remained, a thread that bound them, invisible but unbreakable. One evening, after a long patrol through the Yorkshire moors, they found shelter in an abandoned cottage. The air was sharp with frost, the walls bowed inward with age. Tonks lit a small fire, her breath rising in white puffs. "Remind me," she said, rubbing her hands together. "Why do the Death Eaters always choose the coldest places in Britain to hide?" Remus smiled faintly. "Evil rarely concerns itself with comfort. Maybe they just like dramatic scenery." "Possibly." Her grin widened. "Do you think Voldemort stands in front of mirrors practicing his menacing speeches?" He choked on his tea. "Tonks." "What? I'm serious. I am Lord Voldemort. Very theatrical, don't you think? I bet he loves the sound of his own name." He shook his head, trying not to laugh. "You're impossible." "Thank you." She stretched her legs toward the fire, her hair glowing orange in the flickering light. "Someone has to keep you from brooding yourself into an early grave." His amusement faded into something softer. "You've done more than that." Her smile faltered at the sudden gentleness in his voice. "Have I?" He met her gaze. "You've reminded me that there's still light left in this world." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the walls. Then Tonks looked away, her cheeks pinker than the flames. "Careful, Professor Lupin," she said lightly. "Say things like that, and I'll start thinking you're actually fond of me." He hesitated. "Maybe I am." She turned back, startled, but his expression was unreadable, calm, almost serene. The words hung between them, soft but unyielding. Before she could reply, a sudden noise outside shattered the moment. The sharp snap of a twig, the low growl of something not human. Remus was on his feet instantly, wand drawn. "Stay behind me." "Not a chance," she whispered, already at his side. They crept to the door. The night outside was black and thick with fog. Another sound, closer this time, echoed through the trees. Then, from the darkness, a shape emerged, hunched, ragged, its eyes glinting with a feral light. A werewolf. Remus's breath caught. It was too early for the full moon. Whoever it was, they'd been turned recently and had lost control. The creature's growl deepened, vibrating through the air. "Go," Remus said under his breath. "Now! I'm not leaving you. Tonks, please." But she didn't move. The creature lunged and the night erupted in chaos. Remus threw himself forward, shielding her as the beast's claws slashed across his sleeve. Tonks's wand flared. A jet of blue light struck the creature square in the chest, sending it sprawling back. It staggered to its feet again, blood dripping from its muzzle. Remus's voice was low, commanding. "Leave us. You don't know what you're doing." For a moment, the werewolf hesitated, and then, with a snarl, fled into the trees. The silence that followed was heavy and trembling. Tonks's hands shook as she lowered her wand. "Are you—" "I'm fine," he said, though his arm bled freely. "You're not fine." She grabbed his wrist, pressing her wand to the wound. "Episky!" The skin began to knit, though the pain made him wince. When it was done, she didn't let go. "You could have been killed. So could you. Don't you dare make this my fault," she said fiercely. "You keep throwing yourself into danger like you're trying to disappear." He opened his mouth to answer, but the anger in her eyes stopped him. "You think your life doesn't matter because of what you are," she said, voice trembling. "But it does. It matters to me." Her words struck deeper than any wound. He stared at her, unable to speak, and she stepped closer until there was no space left between them. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," she whispered. You never did." And then, before reason could intervene, she leaned up and kissed him. It was not the grand, perfect sort of kiss that belonged to fairy tales. It was fierce, desperate, born of fear and relief, and everything left unsaid. For a heartbeat, he froze, and then his arms wrapped around her, holding her as though the world itself might fall apart if he didn't. When they broke apart, the fire had burned low. Her eyes searched his, waiting for him to retreat, to apologize, to ruin it with doubt. But he didn't. He only said quietly, "You shouldn't have done that." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I'm not sorry." He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, and then the moment passed, fragile as glass. They sat in silence after that, the night pressing close around the cottage. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the moon slid behind a veil of clouds. Tonks leaned against him, exhaustion finally catching up. He hesitated before wrapping an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. Her warmth seeped through the layers of fabric, steady and real. For once, he didn't think about what might come next, about the war, or the curse, or the 1,000 reasons this could never last. For that single night, he allowed himself to simply exist beside her. When dawn came, the fire had burned to ash. Tonks stirred, blinking against the pale light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Remus was already awake, his cloak wrapped around her shoulders. "You should sleep," she murmured. "I did," he lied. She smiled, knowing better. "You're terrible at that." He helped her to her feet, his expression unreadable. "We should report back to Dumbledore." "Right," she said, though her voice was softer than before. As they stepped outside, the forest stretched endless and quiet before them. The night's chaos felt distant now, like something from another lifetime. Yet as they walked side by side through the mist, their hands brushed, and neither pulled away. They didn't speak of the kiss. They didn't have to. It hung between them, unspoken but understood. A promise and a danger both. For in a world ruled by darkness, even a single spark of love could be both a weapon and a curse. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew, whatever lay ahead, nothing would ever be the same again. The rain returned with a vengeance. It poured for days without pause, drumming against the windows of Grimold Place and turning the London streets into silver rivers. Inside, the Order huddled together in restless silence, the air thick with unease. The Ministry was faltering, rumours of disappearances spreading faster than Owlpost could carry them. Even the bravest members of the Order looked worn and hollow-eyed. Remus spent most of his hours in the drawing room, buried in reports. The dim light of the candles flickered across his face, carving deeper shadows beneath his eyes. Across from him, Tonks sat cross-legged on the floor, cleaning her wand. Neither spoke much anymore. Since that night in the cottage, everything between them had changed, though no one else seemed to notice. They still worked together, still moved in unspoken rhythm, but every glance, every brush of hands now carried the quiet, dangerous weight of what they had shared. She wanted to talk about it. He refused to. When she caught him alone one evening, the house long since fallen asleep, she decided she'd had enough. "You're avoiding me," she said, leaning against the door frame. He didn't look up from his parchment. "I'm busy." "Busy, pretending nothing happened?" He set his quill down carefully. "Tonks, please, don't." She crossed the room, folding her arms. "No, We are going to talk about it. You can't kiss someone and then act as if it was a tactical error." His mouth tightened. "You know why I can't." "I know what you think you can't," she interrupted. "You've been repeating the same excuses for months. You're too old, too dangerous, too cursed. I've heard them all." "Because they're true," he said, his voice rising before he could stop it. "You don't know what it means to live with this, to wake up every month wondering if you've hurt someone, to look in the mirror and see—" He broke off, turning away, his hand trembling slightly. Tonks's anger softened. She stepped closer, laying a hand on his shoulder. "I don't care about the scars," she said quietly. "I care about you." He closed his eyes as though the words themselves were painful. "And what happens when you regret it? When you realize what I am?" "I won't." "You say that now," he murmured. She shook her head, tears burning in her eyes. "You're so afraid of being loved that you'd rather be miserable than take the risk." He didn't answer. The silence stretched between them until she turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. When the door closed behind her, he sank back into his chair and covered his face with his hands. He could still feel the warmth of her fingers on his skin, the memory of her voice like a whisper that wouldn't fade. The next day brought new orders. The Death Eaters had struck again, a small Muggle village in Wiltshire left in ruins. Dumbledore sent a team to investigate. Remus, Kingsley, and Tonks were among them. The aftermath was worse than any of them expected. Smoke still rose from the wreckage when they arrived. The stench of burned timber and magic hung in the air. Children's toys lay half buried in ash. Tonks knelt beside what remained of a cottage door, her expression bleak. They didn't even bother hiding what they did. Remus crouched beside her. "Fear is the weapon," he said softly. "They want people to know." Kingsley called from across the square. "Over here." They followed him to the edge of the ruins, where the faint shimmer of a ward still pulsed in the air. Inside it lay a man, unconscious but alive. His robes were torn and marked with the dark mark. "Death Eater," Kingsley muttered. Remus knelt beside him, scanning the sigils. A rebound curse. He tried to cast something. It turned on him. Tonks frowned. "He's still breathing. What do we do with him?" "Take him back," Kingsley said grimly. "Dumbledore will want answers." As they prepared to leave, a faint groan escaped the man's lips. His eyes flickered open, dull with pain. "You can't stop him," he rasped. "He's already inside. The Ministry." Then he went still. Tonks's blood ran cold. "Inside the Ministry. What does he mean?" Remus didn't answer, but his face had gone pale. "We need to tell Dumbledore. Now." By the time they returned to headquarters, the news had already reached the Order. There had been a break-in at the Department of Mysteries. Several auras were missing. The war had shifted again. That night, Grimold Place was alive with voices. Tense, sharp, urgent. Plans were drawn, arguments flared. Tonks sat at the end of the table, numb, listening but barely hearing. She could feel Remus's presence beside her, steady but distant. When the meeting ended, everyone scattered to prepare for what might come next. She stayed seated long after the others had gone. He was the one who broke the silence. "You should rest." "So should you," she said without looking up. He hesitated. "Tonks, about last night. I don't want to hear it. Please." She rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "No," "Remus, you don't get to say please after spending months shutting me out." He stood too, his face drawn with guilt. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Then stop doing it." "I'm trying to protect you." Her laugh was sharp and bitter. "From what? From yourself. You're not some cursed creature that needs to be locked away. You're a man, a good one. But if you keep running from everything that frightens you, you'll end up alone." She brushed past him, heading for the door. But before she reached it, his voice stopped her. "I already am," he said quietly. She turned back. The look on his face, raw, unguarded, cut straight through her anger. For a heartbeat, she almost crossed the room again. Almost. But she didn't. "Not forever," she said softly. "Not if you stop pretending you have to be." Then she was gone. The house grew still again, the storm outside lashing against the windows. Remus sank into the nearest chair, staring into the fire until the embers blurred. Tonks's words echoed in his head, refusing to fade. He had spent so long living half a life, denying himself joy, convincing himself that solitude was safety. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure he could go back to that empty quiet. Not after her. Outside, thunder rolled over the rooftops, and for the first time in years, Remus Lupin let himself hope. Hope that perhaps, even in the middle of a war, love was not something to fear. But hope, like all fragile things, was easily shaken. And before the next full moon rose, the war would test it in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The war did not pause for grief or for love. It pressed on, ruthless and unrelenting, swallowing every quiet moment the Order tried to preserve. Weeks turned into months, and the world outside Grimold Place seemed to darken with each sunrise. The Ministry no longer spoke the truth. The papers printed lies, and even the air in Diagon Alley carried a hum of fear. For Tonks, the weight of it all was suffocating. Her work as an aura had grown dangerous. Most of her colleagues were either missing or pretending not to see what was happening around them. Each mission she returned from left her a little more hollow, a little more withdrawn. Remus noticed it, of course. He saw how her laughter had dulled, how the colour in her hair faded to a muted brown whenever she thought no one was watching. But he didn't know how to reach her anymore. Not after the last argument. Not after she'd walked away with tears glinting in her eyes. Still, she haunted his thoughts. No matter how far he went, no matter what missions Dumbledore sent him on, her voice lingered. When he closed his eyes, he saw her standing in the doorway, fierce and unflinching, telling him he didn't have to be alone. He wanted to believe her. Merlin help him, he did. But the guilt in his chest was a beast of its own, one he had never been able to tame. One night, the Order gathered again. The air in Grimold Place was tense, the candles flickering with every raised voice. Dumbledore was away on business only he could explain, and Moody's gravelly tone filled the room. "Ministry's practically crawling with Death Eaters," Moody said. "Kingsley's holding the line, but it won't last long. We need to start thinking like we're already underground." Tonks sat near the end of the table, her expression grim. She had barely spoken all evening, answering questions with curt nods. The exhaustion beneath her eyes was impossible to miss. Remus sat opposite her, silent as well. When the meeting finally ended, most of the Order lingered to speak in low murmurs. She was gone before anyone could stop her, slipping out into the corridor like a shadow. Remus followed. He found her in the hallway near the old tapestry, staring at the frayed threads that depicted the Black family tree. Her name, though she had been burned from it, was still faintly visible, a ghost among the darkened names. She didn't turn when he approached. "You shouldn't follow me," she said quietly. "You shouldn't leave alone," he replied. Her shoulders tensed. "What do you want, Remus?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "To make sure you're all right." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think anyone's all right these days?" He took a step closer. "You've changed." "So have you." "Yes," he admitted softly. "But you're fading, Tonks. I see it, and I don't know how to help." Her eyes flashed as she turned to face him. "You can't help because you don't want to be part of this anymore. Part of me. You keep building walls between us and calling it protection." His jaw tightened. "You think I don't care? I left because I do care. Because the thought of you suffering for my sake terrifies me." "Then stop leaving." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't look away. "Stop deciding for both of us what's worth the risk." He wanted to reach for her, to touch her hand, to say that she was right, that he was tired of being afraid. But before he could, the sound of hurried footsteps broke through the corridor. Kingsley appeared at the end of the hall, breathless. "We've got news. Death Eaters at the Ministry. They're moving now." The words struck like thunder. Within minutes, the house was alive with motion. Wands were drawn, orders given. Moody barked commands. Molly cried out names. Remus felt the rush of old instincts flood through him, the grim clarity of battle. He looked for Tonks, but she was already gone, grabbing her cloak and vanishing into the night. The fight at the Ministry was chaos. Spells flashed in every color, glass shattered, walls crumbled beneath the force of curses. The echo of screams filled the air like thunder. Tonks moved through it all with fierce precision, deflecting hexes, shielding others, her every motion a desperate act of defiance. When Remus found her, she was cornered near the Hall of Prophecy, her wand hand shaking from exhaustion. "Behind you!" he shouted. She turned just in time, deflecting a curse that would have struck her heart. They moved together after that, back to back, the way they always fought best, two halves of a single rhythm. Then Sirius appeared, wild and alive, dueling Bellatrix with reckless joy. The air burned with power. Tonks saw it first, saw the curse that struck him squarely in the chest, saw his body fall backward into the veil. "No!" Remus's shout drowned in the roar of battle. He grabbed her before she could run forward, holding her as she struggled, screaming Sirius's name. "He's gone," Remus said, voice breaking. "Tonks, he's gone." She went still in his arms. The world blurred, the crash of spells, the cries, the chaos fading into a hollow silence. By the time Dumbledore arrived, the Death Eaters were fleeing. Remus didn't remember leaving the Ministry. He remembered only the feel of her trembling against him, the unbearable sound of her quiet sobs. Grimmauld Place felt different after that. The house was emptier, colder. The portrait of Mrs. Black seemed quieter now, as if even she understood that something sacred had been lost. Tonks stayed upstairs most days. The laughter that had once filled the halls had vanished completely. Her hair remained its natural brown, her eyes shadowed and distant. Remus tried to reach her, but words failed him. Every time he approached, she turned away. Every time he thought to speak, guilt stole the courage from his throat. He spent his nights pacing the corridors, haunted by the memory of her cries, of Sirius's fall, of the war that never seemed to stop taking. One evening, he found her sitting on the staircase, staring into the dark. "Tonks," he said softly. She didn't look up. "He was your friend?" "Yes." "You lost him, and I—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I don't know how to keep losing people, Remus. I don't know how to do it again." He sat beside her, the steps creaking beneath their weight. For a while, neither spoke. The house groaned softly around them, the wind whispering through the cracks. At last he said, "Then we don't face it alone." She turned to him, her eyes red, her voice a whisper. "You still believe that?" He met her gaze, tired, wounded, but still steadfast. "Yes, because if we stop believing, then the war's already won." For a long time, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was steady. And though the world outside remained dark and merciless, for that single moment they found something unbroken, a small, flickering flame in the ruins of all they'd lost. It was not peace, it was not happiness, but it was hope, fragile, defiant, and real. Summer arrived without warmth. The war had swallowed the season whole, leaving behind only grey skies and uneasy silences. Grimold Place felt hollow now, haunted by Sirius's absence and the grief that lingered in every shadowed corner. The portrait of Mrs. Black had fallen quiet, as though even her fury had been stilled by the weight of loss. Tonks tried to keep busy. She threw herself into work, taking double shifts for the ministry, training new auras, running messages for the Order. Anything to avoid thinking. Anything to avoid the stillness. Her hair stayed the same dull brown it had been since the night of the battle. The bright colours she'd once worn now buried under sorrow. Remus watched her fade from a distance. He had lost Sirius too, but the grief that hollowed him out was different. It was quieter, older, the kind of pain that didn't scream but simply stayed. Yet watching Tonks retreat into herself hurt worse than any scar. He wanted to reach for her, to share that silence, but he didn't know how anymore. Every time he tried, she slipped away like smoke. It was Molly Weasley who finally said what everyone else refused to. "She's breaking, Remus," Molly told him one evening as they stood by the kitchen hearth. "She won't talk to anyone, won't eat properly, barely sleeps. You must see it." "I see it," he admitted, his voice low. "Then do something." He shook his head. "I don't know what to say to her. I've already done enough damage." Molly sighed, her eyes softening. "You can't protect her by vanishing. That's not how love works." Love. The word struck him harder than any curse. He didn't answer, and Molly didn't press. She only looked at him a moment longer before turning back to her work. That night, Remus couldn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire, the embers glowing faintly like scattered stars. He thought of all the words he'd left unsaid, of the moments lost to fear and pride. And by dawn, he made a decision. He found her the next morning at the far edge of the garden behind Grimold Place, where the grass had grown wild and unkempt. She was sitting on a fallen stone, her wand resting across her knees, her gaze distant. "You've been avoiding me," he said quietly. She didn't turn. "You've been letting me." He winced. "Fair." For a moment, neither spoke. The breeze carried the faint scent of honeysuckle and rain. Finally, she asked, "Why are you here, Remus?" because you need to stop running from what you feel. That made her laugh, a bitter, broken sound. That's rich, coming from you. He almost smiled. I deserve that. She rose then, brushing dirt from her cloak. You don't get to come here and act like this is simple. You pushed me away when I needed you most. And now you show up and... What? Expect me to forgive you? No, he said softly. I came to tell you that I was wrong. She froze. I thought I was doing the right thing, he continued. That by keeping my distance, I was sparing you pain. But all I did was create more of it. For both of us. Her eyes glistened. Then why, Remus? Why did you make me feel like loving you was a mistake? He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I thought I was a mistake. The words broke something open in the air. For a heartbeat, she simply stared at him. Then, with a trembling breath, she said, You're not. He looked down, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself believe her. I've lost too many people, he murmured. James, Lily, Sirius, everyone I cared for seems to vanish. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you too. Then stop trying to make me leave, she said fiercely. Stop deciding I'd be safer without you. You don't get to protect me from my own choices. He reached out then, slowly, as though afraid she might disappear. When his hand brushed her cheek, she didn't pull away. Her skin was cool beneath his fingertips, her eyes wide and shimmering. I can't promise you safety, he said. Only that I'll stand beside you, however long this lasts. That's all I ever wanted, she whispered. And before either could speak again, she leaned forward and kissed him, not with the urgency of fear, but with quiet certainty. This time, he didn't pull away. He kissed her back, his hand cupping her face, his heart pounding with something like hope. When they parted, she smiled. A real smile, small but bright, the first he had seen from her in months. About time, she said softly. He laughed under his breath. You'll be the end of me. I'll try not to be, she said, and for a moment the war felt far away. They didn't speak of it after that. There was no need. Something between them had settled. Fragile, unspoken, but true. They worked together again, fought together, lived in the small moments between danger and duty. There were still arguments, of course. Tonks refused to let him retreat into guilt, and Remus refused to let her walk headlong into every peril without a plan. But even their quarrels carried warmth now, a kind of familiarity that anchored them amid the storm. One night, as they prepared for another mission, Tonks turned to him with a faint smile. When this is over, she said, you and I are going to find a little cottage by the sea. No war, no Death Eaters, no cursed portraits, just peace. He looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. And what will we do there? She shrugged. I'll grow flowers. You'll complain about the salt air ruining your books. He chuckled. That sounds perfect. It will be, she said, her voice soft. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. Then we'll survive this. We'll make sure of it. Her grip tightened. Promise? Promise. They stood there for a long time, the night around them still and watchful. The world beyond the window was full of danger, but for that brief hour they let themselves believe in a future that hadn't yet been written. One where they could rest, where laughter might return, where love could exist without fear. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew. Whatever darkness lay ahead, they had already found the light strong enough to guide them through it. For love, once kindled in such a world, was not easily extinguished. It burned quietly, fiercely, like the last candle in a storm, defiant and unyielding, no matter how long the night endured. The world grew darker as summer bled into autumn. The wind turned cold, carrying the scent of rain and ashes. The war that once seemed distant now touched every corner of Wizarding Britain. Muggles vanished without reason. Families fled their homes. The sky itself seemed to mourn, grey and heavy, the light thin and fragile. Grimmauld Place had become a shelter for the weary. The Order met more often now, each gathering bringing worse news than the last. Voldemort's influence had seeped into the Ministry, and fear had become the new law of the land. Through it all, Tonks and Remus clung to their fragile moments of peace. They rarely spoke of love. It existed in quieter ways. The brush of hands in passing, a glance across a crowded room, a shared silence before a mission. Yet the bond between them had deepened into something stronger than either had expected. Still, Remus remained restless. Every night he left before dawn, taking assignments that grew longer, more dangerous. When Tonks asked where he went, he only said, "Among the packs." She knew what that meant. Dumbledore had asked him to continue his work with the werewolves, to bring them to the Order's side before Greyback could claim them. But she also knew how much it cost him, the toll of living between two worlds that both distrusted him. When he returned, his eyes were more tired, his words fewer. And yet, when she smiled at him, he always smiled back. One stormy night, she waited for him in the kitchen. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room. A kettle whistled softly on the stove. He was late, later than usual. Every minute stretched thin, taut with worry. Finally, the door creaked open. He stepped inside, soaked through, his cloak torn at the sleeve. Mud streaked his boots. "You look terrible," she said, relief flooding her words. "I've had better evenings," he murmured, closing the door behind him. She hurried to him, taking his arm. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he said, though his wince betrayed him. "Sit," she ordered. "Now." He obeyed without protest, too tired to argue. She cleaned the wound with her wand, the familiar scent of healing balm filling the air. "I told you not to go alone," she said quietly. "I wasn't alone. There were others." "Werewolves?" He nodded. "Some listen. Most don't. Greyback's promises are easier to believe than mine." She tied a bandage around his arm, her hands gentle but firm. "Then let someone else try." "They wouldn't trust anyone else," he said softly. "I have to keep going." Her hand stilled. "Even if it kills you?" He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw it. The exhaustion, the guilt, the quiet despair. "If it helps the Order, then yes." Something in her broke. "No," she said fiercely. "Not like this. You don't get to throw yourself away for a world that doesn't care what it costs you." He rose, voice low but edged with steel. "This isn't about me, Tonks. You think I want this life. You think I enjoy crawling through the dirt, begging for scraps of loyalty from monsters who see me as half a man. Then why do it?" she demanded. "Because someone must." The storm outside howled through the chimney, rattling the windows. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered, "And what about me?" He froze. What about us, Remus? You talk about duty and sacrifice, but what happens when there's nothing left to fight for? When the war ends? If it ends, what will you have left if you've given away every piece of yourself? He opened his mouth, but no words came. The truth was too heavy. He didn't know how to explain that love, to him, had always felt like a luxury the world could snatch away at any moment. But Tonks stepped closer, her voice trembling. You're not just a weapon in this war. You're a man I love, and I refuse to stand by and watch you destroy yourself. Her confession hung in the air, quiet and absolute. He stared at her, heart hammering. The words he had always feared now lived between them, impossible to take back. Tonks, he breathed. She smiled faintly, though tears glimmered in her eyes. You don't have to say it back. Just don't walk away again. He closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. The rain, the war, the fear. You think I haven't loved you every day since the moment you fell into my life, he said softly. You think I haven't fought it because I knew what it would cost. Her breath caught. I love you, he said, voice breaking. Merlin, help me. I love you more than I have any right to. And then he kissed her, deep, desperate, full of every word he had been too afraid to speak. When they finally pulled apart, the storm had softened to a steady rain. She leaned her forehead against his, her hands tangled in his cloak. Then promise me something, she whispered. Anything. When this war ends, when we survive, you'll stop hiding. You'll let yourself live. He smiled, faint but real. I promise. The days that followed carried a strange calm, as if the world itself were holding its breath before the next great storm. They worked side by side, their bond now open, no longer hidden in glances and silence. The Order noticed, of course. Moody grunted, Molly smiled, and Kingsley pretended not to see. And though danger still loomed, they learned to find small moments of peace, shared meals, midnight walks through the fog, laughter, rare but honest. One evening, as they prepared to leave on another mission, Tonks paused at the door. Remus, she said suddenly, if something happens to me... Don't, he interrupted. Nothing will. But if it does, she insisted, promise you'll keep fighting. Promise you won't give up. He took her hand, pressing it to his chest. Not without you. She smiled then, bright, defiant, alive. Then we'll both come back. They did not know that night how quickly the world would unravel, how much darker the path ahead would become. But for that moment, they believed. And belief, in times like those, was as rare and precious as magic itself. Outside, the rain ceased and the clouds began to part. The moon broke through, pale and full, casting its light across their faces. Remus looked up at it, the old fear stirring in his chest. But when Tonks's hand found his, the fear faded into something else entirely. Not peace, not yet, but courage. And that, he thought, might be enough. The chill of early winter crept through every stone of Grimold Place. Snow fell over London in slow, ghostly drifts, blanketing the city in silence. But inside the walls of the Order's headquarters, the stillness was a fragile illusion. The war was moving faster now. Dumbledore had fallen at Hogwarts, and the entire wizarding world seemed to hold its breath in disbelief. Remus had been away when the news came. When he returned, weary and unshaven, Tonks met him at the door, her face pale and hollow-eyed. He knew before she spoke. The grief was in her silence, in the way she clutched his sleeve as though she needed to hold something real before the world shattered. "He's gone," she whispered. Remus closed his eyes. For a long while, neither moved. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and the shadows on the walls seemed to flicker like ghosts. "Everything's changing now," Tonks murmured. "They'll come for us next. The Ministry, Hogwarts, it's all falling apart." He held her then, one arm around her shoulders, the other pressed to her back. "We'll endure," he said softly, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. But endure they must. There was no other choice. The Order splintered in the weeks that followed. Some went into hiding, others disappeared entirely. Grimmauld Place became both sanctuary and prison, a fortress of secrets and whispered fears. Tonks tried to remain strong, but even her optimism had begun to falter. She had been suspended from duty at the Ministry. Her loyalty was questioned, her career stripped away. Her hair, once a banner of colour and mischief, remained a dull, mousy brown now. Each time Remus looked at her, he felt a sting of guilt, as though his own fears had dimmed her flame. "You need rest," he told her one evening as she sat by the window, staring at the street below. "I need purpose," she replied without looking at him. He hesitated, then crossed the room. "You have one. You fight with the Order. You protect the people who still believe." Her voice cracked slightly. "And what do you fight for, Remus?" He paused. "For you," he said simply. She turned then, her eyes glimmering with something between sadness and gratitude. "Then don't leave again," she whispered. He had no answer, because even then, Dumbledore's last orders echoed in his mind. To continue his mission among the werewolves, to ensure that the darker packs did not side with Voldemort. It was work he could not abandon, no matter the cost. But as he looked at her, he felt the weight of every choice he'd ever made pressing down on him. It was on the night of the first heavy snowfall that he told her. "I have to go," he said quietly. Tonks's wand slipped from her hand. "Go? Where?" "Back to the north. Greyback's pack is stirring again. They're recruiting." "You can't," she said, rising. "You just got back. You promised—" "I promised I'd fight," he said. "And this is how I must." Her eyes hardened. "You promised you wouldn't leave me again." He flinched at the tremor in her voice. "Tonks, if we lose the packs to Voldemort, he'll have an army of monsters. I can't stand aside and let that happen." "And what am I supposed to do while you risk your life? Wait here and wonder if I'll ever see you again?" "I'm trying to protect you." Her laughter was sharp and bitter. "You're trying to protect yourself from loving me too much." He looked away. The truth of it stung. "I can't ask you to understand." "Then don't," she said. "Just go. But don't expect me to wait quietly for you to come back." He hesitated, torn between duty and the ache in his chest. "Tonks." "No," she said, stepping back. "You made your choice." He wanted to tell her he was sorry, that every step away from her would tear at him like claws. But the words caught in his throat. He turned toward the door, cloak heavy on his shoulders, and with a soft crack of displaced air, he was gone. Winter deepened. Weeks passed with no word. Tonks tried to stay busy, assisting Kingsley, delivering messages, training young recruits for a war that already felt lost. But her heart wasn't in it. Each morning, she woke with the same gnawing fear that somewhere in the frozen north, Remus lay dead among enemies. When the Patronus came, it startled her. It was a silver wolf, graceful and bright, gliding through the gloom of Grimold Place. Its voice, warm and familiar, echoed through the air. "I'm alive. The pack listens, though not easily. Be safe, Dora." Her breath caught. He had never used her name that way before, soft, almost tender. For the first time in months, her hair flickered with colour again, a faint pink like the first blush of sunrise. Remus returned at last near the end of winter, weary but unbroken. He found Tonks in the kitchen, her wand clutched tightly as though she might hex the next person who startled her. When she saw him standing there, pale and gaunt but smiling, her knees nearly gave way. "I told you I'd come back," he said. "You took your time. I had to be certain it was safe to leave." She crossed the room and struck his chest with her fist, once, twice, before collapsing against him. "Don't ever do that again." He wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin against her hair. "I'll try not to." "You always say that," she murmured, "and I always mean it." When she finally drew back, she looked at him searchingly. Did they listen? "Some did," he said. "Enough to make a difference." She nodded slowly, then reached up and touched his cheek. "Then you did what you had to. But promise me, from now on, you fight with us, not apart from us." He caught her hand and pressed it to his lips. "With you," he said quietly. "Always with you." That night, they sat together by the fire, the world outside wrapped in snow and silence. For once, there was no talk of missions, no mention of the war waiting beyond their door. Only two souls who had lost too much and still somehow found their way back to one another. The flames reflected in her eyes, gold and soft. "You think we'll live to see peace?" she asked. He was silent for a long time before answering. "I think we'll live to see tomorrow, and for now, that's enough." She leaned against him, closing her eyes. "Tomorrow, then." And though the war still raged beyond the walls, for that one night they let themselves rest, wrapped in firelight and the fragile, stubborn hope that love could endure even this. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in white, as though the world itself were trying to remember what peace once looked like. Spring returned shyly to Britain, though few noticed its arrival. The war had swallowed every season, and even the sunlight that filtered through the clouds felt subdued, weary, as if afraid to linger. At Grimold Place, the fire burned from habit rather than need. The house had become a refuge once again, for fugitives, for auras, for the broken and the brave. Tonks sat at the long kitchen table, hands clasped around a cup of tea gone cold. Her hair shimmered faintly pink again, though the brightness never stayed long. Across from her, Remus watched her quietly. He looked older now, the lines on his face deeper, but the warmth in his eyes had returned. For the first time in months, there was a hint of calm between them. Fragile, yes, but real. Outside, the rain whispered against the windows. "They say Potter's gone," she murmured. Remus nodded. "He's on the run. Dumbledore left him a task. No one knows what it is." Tonks sighed. "He's just a boy." "He's James's boy," Remus said softly. "And Lily's. They raised him for this, even if they didn't mean to." Silence stretched between them again. The war had taken everything, teachers, friends, even hope, yet somehow they endured. Perhaps that, Remus thought, was its own kind of rebellion. By midsummer, the order had gone underground. The ministry had fallen completely under Voldemort's control, and even whispers of defiance were enough to earn a death sentence. Tonks and Remus lived between safe houses now, sometimes together, sometimes apart. When they met, it was always the same. Hurried, breathless moments between danger and duty. But those moments sustained them. One evening, in a cottage hidden deep within the Welsh hills, Tonks returned from a mission soaked to the bone. Remus was waiting for her, pacing by the fire. "You're late," he said, though his tone was more worry than reproach. "The road was watched," she said, shaking off her cloak. "I had to double back twice." He moved to her side, his hands trembling slightly as he brushed damp strands of hair from her face. "You shouldn't have gone alone." She smiled faintly. "You say that every time. And every time you ignore me." She stepped closer. "If I didn't, you'd have no one left to argue with." His lips quirked. "That's true." Her smile faded as she studied him. "You're thinner." "I'm fine," he said, but she frowned. "Remus." "I said I'm fine," he repeated, more sharply than he meant. The words hung heavy between them. She turned away, hurt flashing across her face. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. It's all getting worse. The werewolves, the raids, the disappearances. Every week there's something new." "I know," she whispered, "but we'll keep fighting. That's what we do." He looked at her then, and for the first time in a long while, he saw not the young aura he'd once tried to push away, but a woman of fierce will and boundless courage. He wondered how he'd ever thought she was safer without him. "You still believe we'll win?" he said softly. "I have to," she replied. "If I stop believing, I'll break." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "Then I'll believe with you." The night grew colder. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills. They sat together by the fire, listening to the wind. Tonks rested her head against his shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. "I keep thinking about after," she said. "After?" "When it's over. When we can stop running." He smiled faintly. "You still think there'll be an after?" "I do." "And what then?" She hesitated. "I want a home. Not a safe house. A real one. Somewhere by the sea. I'll plant roses. You'll read by the window and complain about the salt in your tea." He chuckled softly. "That sounds familiar. Maybe I've mentioned it once or twice. And if the world doesn't give us that?" She lifted her head to meet his gaze. "Then we'll steal it for ourselves." Her certainty filled the room like warmth. He pressed his lips to her forehead, breathing her in. The scent of rain, of earth, of something achingly alive. In that quiet moment, with the storm raging beyond the walls, Remus Lupin let himself believe that perhaps love was not weakness, but strength, the only kind left worth fighting for. The months that followed blurred into survival. The order scattered. News came only in fragments. Hogwarts had fallen. Potter was still missing. Each day brought fresh loss. Yet amid the ruin, there were small miracles. One morning, Tonks came to him with trembling hands and shining eyes. "Remus," she said, her voice barely steady. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, he could only stare. The world seemed to tilt. "Are you certain?" he asked, though the joy and fear in her face told him everything. She nodded. "I didn't plan it. Merlin knows this isn't the time, but—" He silenced her with a hand on her cheek. "No, it's all right." Tears spilled down her face. I don't even know if we'll survive this war, Remus. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he dared. Then we'll make sure our child does. For a long time, they simply stood there, the fire crackling behind them, their hearts beating in unison. A child, a life born amid ruin. Hope, fragile and impossible, yet real. In the weeks that followed, Remus changed. His fear did not vanish, but something steadier took its place. Purpose. He spoke to the Order again, fought beside Kingsley and Arthur, and even dared to dream of a world where his child might grow without the weight of shame or war. Tonks glowed despite the danger around them. Her laughter returned, her hair bright once more, a brilliant pink that defied the darkness. Whenever she caught Remus watching her, she would grin and say, "You see, even war can't stop a metamorph magus from being fabulous." And he would smile, because for the first time, he believed her. One night, as they prepared to move to a new hiding place, Tonks paused at the door, her hand resting over her stomach. "Do you think our child will have your eyes, or mine?" she asked. "Yours," he said without hesitation. "They'll see the world brighter than I ever could." She smiled. "Then we'd better give them something worth seeing." Remus stepped forward, drawing her into his arms. "We will," he whispered. "We'll give them peace." Outside, dawn began to break, thin and pale, but real. For a moment, the war felt far away. The sky stretched wide above them, and in its first light, Tonks and Remus stood together, bound not by fear or duty, but by the quiet, unyielding love that had carried them through every darkness. Whatever came next, whatever battles, whatever losses, they would face it as they always had, side by side. And as the sun rose over a world still scarred by war, they held fast to the one truth that no darkness could undo, that love, once found, was the strongest magic of all.